The rain did not stop. It fell in heavy sheets, turning the city air gray and cold. Ezinne pulled her thin coat tighter as she stepped out of the diner's back door. The neon sign above her hummed and flickered, casting a weak pink glow on the wet pavement. She just wanted to get home, to take off her damp shoes and forget about the long hours she had spent on her feet. But as she turned the corner into the narrow alleyway, she saw something that made her heart jump into her throat. A man was slumped against the rough brick wall. He was not a homeless man looking for shelter. He wore a white shirt made of expensive silk that shone even in the dark, but it was ruined. Dark, thick blood was soaking through the fabric, spreading like a red shadow across his chest. His head was tilted back, and his eyes were half closed, his breath coming in short. Painful gasps that sounded like a saw against wood. Ezinne froze. She knew she should run. People like her did not get involved with men in $5,000 suits who ended up bleeding in the trash. She was an immigrant with a visa she could not afford to lose. And in this part of town, being a witness was just as dangerous as being an enemy. If she called the police, they would ask her questions she didn't want to answer. If she stayed, the people who did this to him might come back to finish the job. Her mind screamed at her to keep walking, to pretend she had seen nothing but shadows and rain. But her feet would not move away. She looked at his face and saw the quiet strength there, even as he was fading. He looked like a king who had lost everything in a single night. "Please," she whispered, though he couldn't hear her over the thunder. She thought of her mother back in Nigeria, who always said that a person's worth was measured by what they did when no one was watching. Could she really leave a human being to die in the dirt just to stay safe? The man's hand twitched, his fingers scraping weakly against the wet ground. He was alone, abandoned by his pride and his power, dying in a place that smelled of old garbage and iron. Ezinne took a shaky breath and stepped forward. She opened her black umbrella and knelt beside him, shielding his pale face from the biting rain. The cold water splashed against her knees, but she didn't care. She reached out a trembling hand and touched his shoulder. His skin was like ice. "I've got you," she said, her voice steadying as her fear turned into a mission. "I'm not going to leave you here." Kim Seung-Ho opened his eyes just a crack. He saw the pink of her uniform and the soft, worried look in her dark eyes. He expected to see a killer or a cop, but instead, he saw a girl with an umbrella who had nothing to gain from helping him. He wanted to tell her to go, to save herself before the monsters returned, but the words wouldn't come. Ezinne looked toward the street. She knew her small apartment was only 2 blocks away. It was a risk that could ruin her life, but as she looked at the man's blood mixing with the rainwater, she realized the choice had already been made. She would not be the person who walked away. She would be the one who stayed. The stairs to Ezinne's apartment felt longer than they ever had before. She had to put Kim Seung-Ho's heavy arm over her shoulder, her small frame leaning under his weight as they moved slowly through the dim hallway. Every time a floorboard creaked, she froze, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. She finally reached her door and fumbled with the keys until the lock clicked open. Once inside, she helped him onto her small, worn-out sofa. The room was tiny and smelled like the lavender soap she used to wash her clothes. It was a world away from the cold, bloody alley. Ezinne did not waste any time. She hurried to the kitchen and grabbed a bowl of warm water, clean rags, and her basic first aid kit. When she returned to the sofa, Seung-Ho was watching her. His face was pale, but his eyes were sharp and dark, following her every move with a deep suspicion. He did not speak a word, but his body was stiff, like a wounded animal waiting to see if the person approaching was a friend or a second hunter. Ezinne knelt on the floor beside him. Gently, she began to unbutton his ruined silk shirt. As the fabric pulled away, she saw the deep, jagged cut on his side. It was a nasty wound, and it was still bleeding. She felt a wave of fear, but she took a deep breath and dipped a rag into the warm water. "I have to clean this," she whispered, her voice soft but firm. "It will hurt, but I have to do it so it does not get worse." As she pressed the cloth against his skin, Seung-Ho flinched. His hand flew up and grabbed her wrist in a grip that was surprisingly strong for someone so injured. He stared into her eyes, searching for a trick or a weapon. Ezinne did not pull away. She stayed very still, letting him see the honesty in her face. After a long moment, the tension left his fingers and he let go, dropping his hand back to the sofa. He closed his eyes and let out a long, shaky breath, allowing her to continue. The apartment was silent except for the sound of the rain tapping against the window. Ezinne worked carefully, wiping away the blood and grime. She used a needle and thread from her kit to stitch the widest part of the cut, her fingers trembling slightly but never stopping. She could feel his eyes on her again. He was looking at her simple home, the cheap curtains, the stacks of books, and the single photo of her family back in Nigeria. He seemed confused that someone with so little would risk everything for a stranger like him. He was a man who lived in a world of gold and guns, where every favor had a price. He did not understand why this girl was helping him for free. He kept his jaw tight, refusing to show his pain, but his breathing became easier as the stings of the cleaning ended. Ezinne finally wrapped his chest in clean white bandages, tucking the ends in neatly. When she was finished, she stood up and covered him with her thickest wool blanket. She looked down at him and saw that the fierce, scary look in his eyes had softened just a little bit. He was still a mystery, and she was still afraid of what might happen next. But for now, her home was his fortress. She had turned her quiet life into a shield for a man who had nowhere else to go. Outside the quiet walls of Ezinne's apartment, the city was screaming. The rain continued to fall, but it could not wash away the tension that gripped the streets. Word had spread through the shadows that Kim Seung-Ho had fallen, and like wolves sensing a wound, the rest of the criminal world began to move. In the glass towers downtown, the lights stayed on all night as the balance of power shifted. Dante Reeves did not wait for the body to be found. He sat behind the heavy oak desk that had belonged to Seung-Ho just hours before. Dante was a man who loved chaos because he knew how to use it. He leaned back in the expensive leather chair and lit a cigar, the smoke swirling around his cold, smiling face. He began making phone calls, telling everyone that the old king was dead and a new era had started. He promised more money and more power to those who stayed loyal to him. Those who disagreed were dealt with quickly and quietly. By midnight, the syndicate that Seung-Ho had built with years of hard work was falling into Dante's greedy hands. While Dante celebrated, Han Jun was out in the storm. As Seung-Ho's right-hand enforcer, Han Jun felt the weight of the betrayal more than anyone. He did not believe for a second that his boss was truly gone. He stood in the middle of the alleyway where the ambush had happened, his suit soaked through and his face set in a grim mask. He looked at the empty shells of bullets on the ground and the dark stains that the rain was trying to erase. Han Jun was a man of few words, but his loyalty was like a mountain. He knew Seung-Ho better than anyone, and he knew that if there was even a tiny spark of life left in the man, he would be fighting to stay awake. Han Jun moved from street to street, his eyes searching every corner. He checked the hospitals, the docks, and the hidden warehouses, but there was no sign of the boss. He grew more desperate with every passing hour. He knew that Dante's men were also searching, not to save Seung-Ho, but to finish the job. The city felt like it was on fire, even in the damp cold. Police sirens wailed in the distance, and the air was thick with the feeling that something big was about to break. Han Jun stopped at the edge of the neighborhood where the small diners and old apartments stood. It was a place where people tried to disappear. A place where no one asked questions. He looked at the rows of flickering lights in the windows. He had no clues and no witnesses, but he refused to stop. He didn't know that just a few floors above him, in a room that smelled of lavender and peace, the man he was looking for was finally sleeping. Han Jun gripped the steering wheel of his car until his knuckles turned white. He whispered a promise into the dark. He would find the boss before the fire of Dante's greed burned everything to the ground. The hunt was on, and the clock was ticking for everyone involved. The morning sun tried to peek through the heavy clouds, but the city still felt gray and damp. Ezinne walked back to the diner for her early shift, her body aching from lack of sleep. She had spent the night checking on the man in her spare room, making sure his fever did not get too high. Every time she saw the bandages she had placed on him, she remembered the danger she was in. She walked through the diner doors and began her work, wiping down tables and pouring coffee for the regulars who came in to escape the cold. Everything felt different today. Usually, the diner was a place of comfort, but now every customer who walked in made Ezinne's heart race. About an hour into her shift, the bell above the door jangled softly. A woman stepped inside, but she did not look like the usual workers or travelers. She wore a sharp, professional coat and carried a leather notebook. This was Claire Porter, a famous investigative reporter known for finding secrets that people wanted to keep hidden. Claire sat at the counter and ordered a black coffee. Her eyes were quick and observant, moving across the room and settling on Ezinne. "Long night?" Claire asked, her voice friendly but curious. Ezinne forced a small smile and nodded, trying to keep her hands from shaking as she filled the cup. She knew who Claire was. She had seen her face on the news many times. Claire was a person who could solve crimes and bring the police. Exactly the kind of person who could save Ezinne from the scary situation in her apartment. But Ezinne also knew that if she told the truth, the secret would be out. If the reporter found out that a mafia boss was hiding in a tiny apartment, the story would be on the front page of every newspaper. Within minutes, the bad men who had hurt him would find him, and they would surely hurt Ezinne too for helping him. "I'm a reporter," Claire said, leaning in a little closer. "I'm looking into that big mess that happened in the alleyway just a block from here last night. A very important man went missing, and he was bleeding pretty badly. I heard he might have been seen near here." She watched Ezinne's face closely, looking for any sign of a lie. Ezinne felt a cold sweat on the back of her neck. She thought about the man in her home, the way he had looked at her with suspicion that turned into a tiny bit of trust. She thought about how he had let her help him when he was at his lowest point. If she spoke now, she would be safe from the law. But she would be handing a wounded man over to his enemies. "I didn't see anything," Ezinne said, her voice sounding small but steady. "It was raining so hard last night. I just finished my shift and went straight home to sleep. Most people were inside because of the storm." Claire tapped her pen against her chin, her eyes narrowing just a bit. She didn't look like she fully believed Ezinne, but she didn't have any proof to say otherwise. "It's a dangerous story," Claire warned softly. "The people looking for him aren't the kind you want to cross. If you hear anything, or if someone strange shows up, you should call me." She slid a small business card across the counter. Ezinne tucked the card into her apron pocket, her heart heavy with the weight of her lie. She had just turned away the one person who had the power to take this burden off her shoulders. As Claire finished her coffee and left the diner, Ezinne watched her go through the window. She was more alone than ever now, caught between a reporter's search for the truth and a mafia boss's search for survival. She went back to wiping the tables, knowing that the shadow of the secret was growing longer with every hour. The night was quiet, and the rain had finally slowed down to a soft drizzle. Inside the apartment, the only light came from a small lamp in the corner of the living room. Kim Seung-Ho was sitting up on the sofa, propped up by pillows. He looked much better than he had in the alley, though his face was still thin and tired. Ezinne sat in a wooden chair across from him, sipping a cup of tea to stay awake. For the first time, the air between them did not feel like a battle. It felt like a shared secret. Seung-Ho looked around the room again. His eyes stayed on the photo of Ezinne's family. "Why did you come here?" he asked. His voice was scratchy and low, but it was the most he had spoken since he arrived. He didn't understand why someone would leave their home to work long hours in a place that didn't always welcome them. In his world, people only moved if there was money or power waiting for them. Ezinne looked at the photo and smiled sadly. She told him about her village in Nigeria. She spoke of the heat of the sun, the smell of the spices in her mother's kitchen, and the sound of children playing in the dust. She explained that she had come to this city because she wanted a better life for her family. Every dollar she earned at the diner, after paying her rent, went into an envelope to be sent across the ocean. She told him about the cold winters that made her bones ache, and the people who looked right through her as if she were invisible because of her accent or the color of her skin. "It is not easy to be a stranger," she said softly. "I work until my back hurts, and sometimes I am very lonely. But I have a dream that my younger brother will go to a good school because of my hard work. That dream is what keeps me moving when I want to give up." Seung-Ho listened to every word. He had spent his whole life surrounded by people who wanted things from him. He had seen greed, anger, and betrayal, but he had rarely seen someone work this hard just for the sake of others. He thought about his own life. He had billions of won in the bank and a name that made men tremble, but he realized he was just as lonely as the girl sitting in front of him. All his power had not bought him a single person who would sit in the dark and care for him without asking for anything in return. As Ezinne spoke about the kindness of her neighbors and the small joys of a good day at the diner, something inside Seung-Ho began to change. The ice that had covered his heart for years started to melt. He saw that Ezinne was not lesser than him because she was a waitress or an immigrant. In fact, she was much stronger than the men who had tried to kill him. She had the courage to be kind in a world that was often cruel. "You have a good heart," Ezinne, he said. It was the first time he had used her name. The way he said it was gentle, almost like a promise. Ezinne looked at him and saw a man, not a boss or a monster. She saw someone who had forgotten what it felt like to be cared for. For a moment, they weren't a mafia king and a waitress. They were just two people sharing the truth in the middle of a big, dark city. Seung-Ho leaned back and closed his eyes, a small, real smile touching his lips for the first time in a very long time. He knew that if he survived this, he could never go back to being the man he was before. The peace of the apartment did not last long. Down the hall, behind a door that was always slightly open, lived a man named Mr. Henderson. He was a curious man who spent his days watching the hallway through a tiny peephole. He had seen Ezinne struggle up the stairs with a heavy, bleeding man in a fancy suit. At first, he was just nosy, but then he saw the news. He saw the face of the missing mafia boss on his television screen. And he saw the reward money being offered for any information. Greed is a powerful thing, and it often makes people forget about being a good neighbor. Mr. Henderson picked up his phone. He didn't call the police. He called the number he had seen on a dark car parked at the end of the block earlier that day. He whispered Ezinne's apartment number into the phone, his eyes darting around as if the walls could hear his betrayal. He thought about the money and the new life he could buy, never thinking about the danger he was bringing to the young woman who had always been kind enough to bring him extra soup from the diner. Inside her home, Ezinne was tidying up the kitchen. She felt a strange sense of calm. Seung-Ho was resting quietly, and the storm outside had turned into a gentle mist. But then, the silence was broken. It started with the sound of a heavy car door slamming shut on the street below. Then came the footsteps. These were not the light, quick steps of the neighbors coming home from work. These were the sounds of heavy, polished boots. They moved with a steady, scary rhythm. Thump, thump, thump. They started at the bottom of the wooden stairs and began to climb. Each step made the old building groan. Ezinne froze. She held a plate in her hands, her knuckles turning white. She looked at the door, then at the hallway leading to the room where Seung-Ho lay. She knew that sound. It was the sound of trouble. It was the sound of the world she had tried to keep out finally breaking through her walls. Seung-Ho heard it too, even though he was weak. His ears were trained to hear the approach of an enemy. He sat up in bed, his muscles tensing despite the pain in his side. He looked toward the door, his eyes turning cold and sharp once again. He reached for a heavy glass lamp on the bedside table, the only weapon he had left. The footsteps reached the third floor. They didn't stop at Mr. Henderson's door. They kept coming, slow and heavy, until they stopped right outside Ezinne's apartment. The silence that followed was even scarier than the noise. Ezinne held her breath, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. She prayed that they would move on, that they would realize they had the wrong floor. But then came the knock. It wasn't a friendly tap. It was a loud, booming strike that made the door shake in its frame. The metal lock rattled, and the shadows of large men blocked the light coming from under the door. Ezinne realized then that the secret was gone. The betrayal of a neighbor had brought the monsters to her doorstep, and the fortress she had built was about to be tested. Ezinne stood frozen in the kitchen. Her eyes locked on the door as the wood groaned under another heavy blow. She looked at the shadows dancing under the frame and realized she was no longer just a waitress. She was a target. Before she could scream, a hand reached out from the darkness of the hallway and pulled her back. It was Seung-Ho. He was pale, and his bandages were turning pink again from the strain. But his eyes were no longer tired. They were as sharp as broken glass. He pressed a finger to his lips, telling her to be silent. The door did not just open, it exploded. The lock snapped like a dry twig, and two large men stepped into the small living room. They were dressed in dark coats, their faces hidden by the shadows of their hats. They didn't look like people. They looked like parts of a machine built for hurting. They scanned the room, their eyes landing on Ezinne. But before they could move toward her, the shadow behind her moved first. Seung-Ho did not fight like a normal man. He moved with a scary, quiet grace that showed he had done this 1,000 times. Even with his side leaking blood, he was faster than the giants in the room. He used the small space of the apartment to his advantage. As the first man lunged forward, Seung-Ho stepped to the side and used the man's own weight to send him crashing into the wooden dining table. The sound of breaking would fill the air. But Seung-Ho did not make a single noise. The second man pulled out a short, heavy club, but Seung-Ho was already inside his reach. He struck with his palms and elbows. hitting the man in places that made him gasp and drop his weapon. It was a brutal dance. There were no movie-style shouts or long speeches. There was only the sound of heavy breathing, the thud of fists against skin, and the occasional clatter of a tipped-over chair. Ezinne watched from the corner, her hands over her mouth. She saw the man she had nursed back to health transform into something terrifying. As the fight went on, Seung-Ho's face twisted in a way that wasn't just about the physical pain. Every time a piece of Ezinne's furniture broke, or a photo fell from the wall, his eyes darkened with guilt. He realized that by staying here, he had brought the rot of his world into her sanctuary. He had brought death to the one place that smelled like lavender and peace. He wasn't just fighting the men. He was fighting the fact that he had put an innocent girl in the middle of a war she didn't choose. With a final, powerful kick, Seung-Ho sent the last man reeling out into the hallway. The attacker tumbled down the stairs, joining his partner who was already trying to crawl away. Seung-Ho stood in the doorway, his chest heaving. His shirt was torn, and fresh blood was dripping onto the floorboards. He looked at the mess of the apartment, the broken dishes, the tipped sofa, and the fear in Ezinne's eyes. He didn't look at her with pride for winning. He looked at her with a deep, heavy sadness. He realized that the shadow of his past had returned, and it was too big for this tiny home to hold. He had tried to hide from his life, but his life had found him, and it had almost taken Ezinne with it. He leaned against the doorframe, his strength finally leaving him. He knew that the fight was over for tonight, but the danger was only just beginning. He had to make a choice to save her, even if it meant becoming the monster he had started to forget. The next morning, the diner was not a place of comfort anymore. It was a trap. Seung-Ho knew that Dante Reeves would not stop until he finished what he started in the alleyway. Instead of running away, Seung-Ho decided to meet the danger where it all began. He put on his suit, which was now cleaned and pressed, though he could still feel the pull of the stitches in his side. He looked at Ezinne, who was wearing her pink uniform, her face pale but determined. She refused to leave him. They walked into the diner just as the sun began to rise. The air inside smelled like old coffee and floor cleaner. A few minutes later, a black car pulled up to the front. Dante Reeves stepped out, followed by a group of men in dark coats. Dante walked into the diner with a confident smile, looking at the booths and the counter as if he already owned them. He sat down across from Seung-Ho while his men stood by the door, blocking the exit. "You look good for a dead man, Seung-Ho," Dante said, his voice cold and mocking. He looked at Ezinne, who was standing behind the counter, her hands gripped tightly together. "And I see you found a little bird to look after you. It's a shame she had to get involved in a man's business." Seung-Ho did not flinch. He looked at Dante with the calm, steady stare of a man who had nothing left to lose. "This stops today, Dante," Seung-Ho said quietly. "You wanted my chair, and you took it. But you crossed a line when you came to this neighborhood. You brought your war to an innocent woman's doorstep." Dante laughed, but the sound was sharp and mean. "I don't care about lines. I care about power. And right now, I have all of it." He nodded to his men, and they reached into their jackets. But Seung-Ho was ready. He didn't use a gun, he used the truth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder. He pressed play, and the room was filled with Dante's own voice from a secret meeting, talking about how he had planned to betray not just Seung-Ho, but the other big bosses in the city too. The men standing by the door froze. They looked at each other, realized that Dante had lied to them as well. In that moment of confusion, Han Jun and a dozen loyal men burst through the back entrance. The diner was suddenly filled with the sound of shouting and the clatter of chairs being knocked over. The fight was quick and fierce. Seung-Ho stood up, his hand pressing against his wounded side, and walked toward Dante. Dante tried to run, but Han Jun was already there, blocking his path. "The war is over, Dante," Seung-Ho said, standing tall. He looked around the diner, at the broken sugar shakers and the spilled coffee. He saw Ezinne watching him, her eyes wide with fear, but also with a strange kind of hope. He realized that winning this fight wasn't about being the boss again. It was about making sure that the pink uniform she wore never had to be stained with blood again. Seung-Ho signaled to Han Jun to take Dante away. The noise died down, leaving the diner in a heavy silence. The sun was finally shining through the windows, lighting up the dust in the air. Seung-Ho looked at Ezinne and gave her a small, tired nod. He had ended the war, but he knew he could never go back to being the king. He had found something much more important than a throne in a cold alleyway and a warm apartment. The city began to heal, and so did the neighborhood. The broken glass was swept away, and the smell of smoke was replaced by the fresh scent of new paint. Life returned to its normal rhythm, but things were not quite the same as before. The diner, which had been the site of a scary battle, was completely rebuilt. It now had shiny new counters, comfortable leather booths, and a kitchen that gleamed under bright lights. Ezinne stood behind the counter, no longer just a worker, but the manager of the place. She wore a new pink uniform, and her smile was genuine because the fear that had once shadowed her eyes was gone. A strange thing began to happen in the streets around the diner. Old apartment buildings were repaired, and new playgrounds were built for the children. A mysterious anonymous donor had set up a fund that paid for the college tuition of every young person in the community. It also paid for the medical bills of people like Mr. Henderson, despite his past mistakes. The neighborhood, which had once been a place where people felt invisible, was now full of hope and new opportunities. Ezinne often looked at the business card Claire Porter had left her, but she never called. Some secrets were meant to stay buried in the rain. One Sunday morning, a sleek, black luxury car pulled up to the curb across from the diner. The engine hummed quietly, a sound of power and wealth that didn't fit with the simple street. Inside the car, sitting in the back seat, was a man in a perfectly tailored gray suit. He wore an expensive watch that glittered in the sunlight, and his face was calm and composed. It was Kim Seung-Ho, but he looked different than the man who had arrived in the alley months ago. The coldness in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet peace. He watched through the tinted window as Ezinne stepped out of the diner to hang a welcome sign on the door. She looked happy and strong. He saw her laugh as she talked to a neighbor, and he saw the way she stood tall, no longer burdened by the weight of a secret. He had kept his promise to dismantle his old life of crime. He had died to the world of the Mafia, leaving his billions to the people who actually needed it. He was no longer a king of an empire built on fear. He was a silent guardian of a community built on kindness. Seung-Ho signaled to the driver. He didn't need to go inside, and he didn't need a thank you. Seeing Ezinne safe and successful was all the reward he required. He had learned that a single act of mercy from a stranger could rewrite a person's entire destiny. As the car pulled away from the curb, he didn't look back. He drove away into a new life, leaving behind a legacy that would protect Ezinne and her dreams forever. The man who had been dying in the rain was finally truly free.